Well, we're about to start the webinar here. This is our second episode of DataOps.live or DataOps Unfiltered. And the topic for today is going to be best practices of CI/CD on Snowflake. And with that, we're going to explain for some of you who it may be new to you, our continuous integration and continuous development. And I'm really happy on this episode to be joined by both Guy Adams from DataOps.live, as well as a man in the Snowflake world who kind of needs no introduction, Kent Graziano, the previous Snowflake data evangelist. So as we're getting started here, we just jump into the topics, but why don't you two just briefly describe yourselves and introduce yourselves?
Okay. So, yeah, Guy, I'm CTO at DataOps.live. Been in the Snowflake world for about 7 years, developing this concept of DataOps. But prior to that, my history was 20 years in the software DevOps CI/CD world. So that's kind of that's my background is traditional software DevOps and CI/CD, and then bringing that to data and what's the same and in particular what's different.
Hey everybody, Kent Graziano here. Yeah, I joined Snowflake in the very early days in 2015. I was employee 103, and I became the chief technical evangelist for the company up through end of 2021 when I kind of semi-retired. Prior to that, I had several decades of data warehousing, primarily in the Oracle world, and before that, I like Guy was in software development. I did all kinds of things with Fortran and BASIC and in the scientific world, and then eventually moved into data management. And then as I got into databases, it migrated into data warehousing and agile data warehousing, and then joined the band at Snowflake and had a great time.
Thanks, Kent. And for those of you who don't know me, my name's Frank Bell, Snowflake Data Superhero. Similar to Guy, I started with Snowflake as one of the main integrators and called IT strategist. We sold that business and eventually it was acquired by Accenture. But I've been in this data world too and trying to do agile. And I ran a consulting company for 20 years, and we actually did, it was probably 2005, 2006. We worked with this company called Spot Runner. It was kind of one of the earliest implementers of, it was mostly on top of the Microsoft framework of continuous integration, continuous development. So we actually were doing this with automated builds, failures on top of the Microsoft platform. And then that company kind of had an interesting history, but they did present, I think, in Microsoft's professional development conference because we're the forerunners of doing this kind of CI/CD thing, not with data, but with code at the time. So we think that most of you have joined this are probably understand continuous integration, continuous development, at least on the DevOps or let's call it the code side. Continuous integration is a lot about GitHub and our different Git implementations where you check things in, it gets integrated automatically. And then continuous deployment is done in various different ways, but it's the deployment of that code to some level of either testing or production that you can get value from it. And the big thing about this, it just makes the software development and data development much more agile. So with that, we're going to really just dig into CI/CD and really explain it to you. And we'll start off with Guy, who's one of the experts in this. And go ahead with it, Guy.
Thanks, Frank. So as I often do, because my background is still significantly more software than it is data, I take a lot of this back to the software world. And ultimately, certainly one of my tenets and one of our tenets, DataOps.live, has been we're not trying to reinvent new wheels in the data world. We're trying to say what works well in the software world. Let's bring that across. Let's use that where it makes sense. And only where there are places it doesn't work, let's invent something new. And so CI/CD is clearly something that's come from the software development world, sort of half come via the cloud infrastructure world. So if we think what do we mean by continuous integration? Let me take it back to a software principle perspective. A team of engineers are working on a modern microservice architecture application. So they are, they've got 6, 7, 8 different microservices all working together. And the old way of doing it was that you'd write sort of an interface specification, then you'd go into a black hole for 9 months, you'd write all your code, you'd come back, you'd give someone else your binary, and you'd hope these things would talk to each other. And no matter how good your interface specification was, they would never, ever, ever work, and you'd spend months and months and months trying to unpick why. That was the kind of the monolithic way of doing it. The continuous integration way of doing it is say, okay, we've got one system. Yes, we may have broken it down into smaller parts to make it easier to work on, easier to develop, easier to troubleshoot. But ultimately, we still want to be deploying this as one thing. So we continuously integrating, which means that at the end of today, my changes are going into whatever my integration branch is, but also changes from other people, maybe to the same code base as me, maybe the same microservice, maybe even to other microservices. So we're continuously taking all the pieces of work that are being done and running them through what we call integration tests, making sure they all work together. And the biggest reason, the biggest value of that is we find out where things break very, very quickly. So if you think about, I've gone into a black hole for 9 months, I've developed something and it doesn't work with the code from the person sitting next to me. Well, I've written an awful lot of code in 9 months. So the problems could be anywhere. If I've only done 3 hours of development and I commit my code and it breaks someone else's stuff, or someone else's stuff breaks my stuff, I've got a maximum of 3 hours worth of code to look at to find out where it broke or why it broke. So one of the biggest benefits of continuous integration is that we're doing tiny, tiny, tiny amounts of work before we check that what we've done works with other people's stuff. And we're taking the tiny, tiny amount of work that other people have done and checking that it works with our stuff. Now, if I was to take that out of a software context and explain it more in a data context, I would say, the end-to-end system is our end-to-end pipeline. So we might have a data ingestion tool or multiple data ingestion tools. We'll almost certainly have some data transformation tools. We'll have some schema management tools that are looking after the database structure. We'll have some permissions management, some grant management tools. We'll have maybe some Python code for doing data enrichment. We'll have some data catalog integration. We'll have maybe 8, 9, 10 different pieces that all of those have to work for me to end up with a useful thing at the end of it. Typically more and more we're talking about the useful thing as a data product, but all these things have to work. So maybe my team is working on, or maybe I'm working on some of the data transformation stuff. So I make some data transformation changes. It works for me in my micro environment. Then I commit it to an integration branch, and all of a sudden the integration branch fails. Now, okay, is that I broke something? But when I go and have a look at a merge, okay, it looks like in the last hour or in the last half hour or whatever, someone's also merged some changes to do with the data ingestion. Okay, so now we've got a problem, but we know which two people need to get together, and we've isolated. It's not a problem with the data catalog. It's not a problem with the testing. It's not a problem with this. We know we've only got 2 changes: one data transformation, one data ingestion. Right, we can now go and look at those two sets of changes very quickly. And the really interesting part of it is it may be that neither of those changes on their own broke it. It may well be the interplay between the 2 changes that broke it. So it's not my fault. I didn't break it. It's not Dave's fault. He didn't break it. It's the fact that we've independently done 2 things which worked on their own but didn't work when we put them together. But it takes me and Dave 15 minutes to sort that out because we've got such a small footprint to work on. So when we talk about continuous integration data world, is all of these different pieces, all of these different parts of the data pipeline that all have to work together, and we're constantly making changes and we're constantly testing that end to end. If I look at the other side of it, the continuous deployment part of it, this is a little bit more of a misnomer, and this is where there's some more significant differences in the software world. If you look at a really modern web application type company, you look at an Etsy or an eBay or a Netflix and whatever, they're doing tens of thousands of deployments a day. There are no maintenance windows. There are no configuration freezes. Every change goes off into a branch. It gets developed, it gets tested, it goes into an integration branch, it gets tested there, it goes into a pre-production branch or SAT or QA, but at some point it gets merged into the production branch, and that automatically triggers a deployment of that code. There is no one saying, hey, should we deploy it at 10 p.m.? It goes in continuously. So that's the principle behind continuous delivery or continuous deployment. In the data world, that very rarely happens. And, a lot of people kind of start getting wrapped around the axle and say, well, we're not really doing continuous delivery if we're not pushing these things out, 50, 100 times a day. And I think the reality is in the data world, it is less applicable to be pushing things out, to the same data product hundreds of times a day. It does make sense to batch these up and maybe do them once a day or something like that. It's not, to me, that's not in breach of the spirit of continuous delivery. What it means is I've got a set of changes that are ready to go whenever I want them to go. Whether I choose to let them go out the door in real time, or whether I choose to say once a day, let me push them out the door, that's a decision that I can make at a release manager level. But the point is, from an engineering perspective, I've got this constant pipeline of changes that as soon as they hit the main branch are ready to go. So I am ready for continuous deployment. It may be that an organization puts in a slightly artificial stop there, a slightly artificial buffer there, and that's completely okay.
And that's still light years ahead of where we were in the data world for decades, where if we got something out, eventually we got to the point where it's like, oh, if we could pull it off in 3 months, that was agile. I had to tell people early in the data warehousing world is like, okay, you don't have to release things, well, in 2 weeks. We didn't have to do 2-week iterations. If we can pull off 4 times a year, that's more agile than we've been for 2 decades. And then we got down to, okay, how about once a week? And then we get down to what you're talking about, right? It's like, can we do it once a day, right? Because now we're being much more flexible, much more adaptable, meeting the business needs in a much more agile fashion than what the data world used to do in comparison to what was happening in software.
Yeah, and it's and that maturity cycle applied in the software world as well. When I first started doing CI/CD in the software world, we were not pushing out hundreds of times a day. We were, at best, we were going to be releasing once a sprint, once every 2 weeks. So that is a maturity cycle that the software world went through, and the data world is going through. It's just going through a couple of steps behind. And when I first started talking about DataOps, and I would say to people, look, if you can do 1 release a month, fantastic. Everyone was cheering. Now, if I go out and talk to prospective customers about once a month, they laugh at me. That shows you how far, in just a few years, the DataOps world has come, where, a couple of years ago, what monthly releases was aspirational. Today, amongst most organizations, it's kind of, a bit of a joke if you were talking about monthly releases.
Yeah, it's funny to see over my 30-year or so career. When I was in the Air Force, when I first started, my project was like revolutionary because we were doing releases every 3 months because it was seriously every year. And that's, that was the normal. And yeah, to see it. And then when I heard the consulting company early on, it was funny because everybody would have like a release a week, and then you do it on Friday, and then if it went wrong, it'd be like a nightmare. So
and there goes your weekend.
Decided to do that. But yeah, this is fantastic, Guy, and thanks for explaining that. And I hope everybody captured this. It's really 2 sides of this: the continuous integration that's happening and the continuous deployment. And my guess, though, is probably maybe 10%, 20% of Snowflake customers have really gotten there, because to hand code this, or to even like this evolved over time, there's mostly like things that are put together, whether you're using Azure. Jeremiah Hansen has done, I don't know, the last 5 or more years, all sorts of articles on this. But Kent was actually one of the earliest innovators with this. I don't know, 2016 or something, you started writing on this. Can you kind of describe what you saw and how this evolved?
Yeah, so I started working on agile approaches to data warehousing in the early 2000s. And then when I got introduced to Snowflake, one of the great things about it, I saw some of the features of Snowflake, the architecture I could see immediately we could be much more agile. So yeah, like you said, in mid to late 2016, I wrote a blog post on adopting an agile DevOps approach to Snowflake and using what is now we call zero copy clone. Because in my previous couple of decades of data warehousing, almost never did we actually get to test stuff really before we put it into production. If we were lucky, if we had a dev instance of the database and a QA instance of the database, having both of those was definitely a miracle. But they were usually, if we were lucky, 10% of the size of our production environment, which of course meant that most stuff wasn't tuned at minimum. If it worked in production, it wasn't going to work well because we couldn't test it at scale. And zero copy cloning gave us that in Snowflake. And so early on, I worked out with Steve Herskovitz, who was the VP and eventually EVP of sales engineering at Snowflake. How do we do this with that? And we wrote all the code. The blog post is actually still out there on the Snowflake site. We wrote all the code. So back to what Frank was just talking about, the manual way of putting this together. And then we presented it when we launched Snowflake in Europe. We did a huge all-day event, had 500 people at a venue in London, and all afternoon we did a series of sessions on doing Agile with Snowflake. And this was one of the presentations, and I know that the guy's other co-founder of DataOps.live is Justin Mullen, and he was actually in the audience and got to see this presentation early on. So, very early, we started being able to have these conversations about being agile and doing DevOps with Snowflake at a data level, which this is something you could never do in any other database this way. You couldn't easily create branches of your schemas and branch the data at the same time, as Guy will point out. It's like, yes, we're not just talking about branching the DDL or the schema, but now we're talking about branching the data in the schema at the same time so you can do the testing. And until Snowflake came around with the new architecture and zero copy cloning, there was no easy certainly no economical way to do it. You had to have a boatload of money and a boatload of hardware if you were actually going to have your dev and QA environment the same size as production. Any real data warehouse never was able to do that because you're into hundreds of gigabytes and eventually into terabytes of data. And it was just prohibitively expensive. So Snowflake allowed us to do that. And then after that, while I started attending a lot of Agile tech conferences. I ran into this concept about data ops, and that was where we started putting that together. It's like, yeah, there is something different about data, as Guy was describing, that it's not just DevOps. And then you start putting two and two together. It's like, hey, we can do this in Snowflake. We can really do this in Snowflake. And in the end, the ability to be agile, to do really agile environment management, and looking at the CI/CD and DevOps concepts, those became 3 of the 7 pillars of true data ops. And when Guy and Justin approached me about, what were the problems Snowflake customers had, CI/CD was the one I was hearing all the time out in my evangelist role and my advising with our customers, or like, how do we do CI/CD? How do we do CI/CD? So we get the GitHub thing and we get what we could do with some of the code, but what do we do with the database? And so that led to a lot of the features really in DataOps.live. Was the implementation of this. We had the concepts of what we're trying to do, the 7 pillars of true data ops, and that then drove really kind of the product roadmap for DataOps.live. And somewhere in one of our documents, we even said, until Snowflake came along, you really couldn't truly do this at a data level. And that's really where, data ops really became real, was once we got to that point.
Yeah, and I get asked that question
Yeah.
all the time. It's like, why did data ops not happen as a discipline, as an industry before it did? And the answer was, you could try, and you could like you did, Kenneth, and I know, like you did, Frank. You could do bits and pieces of it, and you could try and have people working in an agile way. But when you had to book 2 hours on the dev database, and you had to book it a week in advance, that's you can be as agile as an individual, as a team, as you want, but when the technology isn't there to support that, you're gonna really struggle.
Yeah, one of the companies I worked with pre-Snowflake, where we actually had dev and QA servers that were large enough to really handle this, we would still end up having to put in a request and sometimes wait a week to run our integration testing, right? We had to get approval and permission, and they had to make sure there was enough disk space and all of these things. And, the cloud changed that, the accessibility of the disk. And then Snowflake's architecture changed it, one step more of, you don't have to ask, right? It was that automatic expansion. It's like you insert data, it grows. And then you throw zero copy cloning on, it's like you can have a 2 terabyte data warehouse and just execute a clone statement. And now you've got a copy of it that you can go play with and start messing around and doing all of this sort of thing.
But I think that there is a really important best practice point in what you just said there, Ken, which is you can do this and you have the capability to do this. What I still find is on a fairly regular basis, working with organizations who are, pretty well into using Snowflake, but still have the processes and procedures from when they were running racks of servers.
Yes.
And we
ran into that very early on of people insisting they had to have 2 different Snowflake accounts because security said they had to be physically separate accounts with different firewalls. It's like, wait, no, we're talking about the cloud now. We're not talking about Oracle or SQL Server or Teradata servers with databases that are in a data center. And it literally took at least 2 years to get many organizations past that, and you're still seeing it today.
No, and I don't think they are. I don't think a lot are. I spoke to an organization not that long ago that said, well, in Snowflake, when you want to go and create a database, which we think of as an ephemeral thing that happens hundreds of times a day in most organizations, you had to put in a change request, a trouble ticket to create a database. It's like
that's not agile.
You're taking this Ferrari, and you're putting wagon wheels on it, and it's the old if you try and do the same thing again and again, and you want to get different results, it's people who are moving to Snowflake but still keeping the old processes and procedures, and particularly it's that interface between kind of an enterprise IT and the teams actually doing the work, doing the domain specific work. It's typically that separation in larger organizations. It's very highly governed. There's a lot. Those procedures and processes took 5 or 10 years to agree, and take potential another 5 or 10 years to change them. But that's one of the biggest challenges we see. They're not technological. Snowflake can do that. DataOps.live can do it like that.
It's people and processes.
But the permissions, the people doing the work have permissions to do it, so they've got to go and change it. So the execution when the change request is finally approved takes 3 seconds, but it takes 3 weeks for that ticket to go around the mill.
Right, and I think that's one of the benefits that you guys brought with DataOps.live is all of that is incorporated in a single pane of glass, including the governance, and so they can have those processes, but now we can automate that to the point that's you have a merge request and you can kick off an email, a notification to whoever the approver is, and they just literally have to click a link and click a button and you're done. And it doesn't have to wait 3 weeks for a committee meeting to happen, as long as everybody's agreed that this is how we're going to do it. And then you've got the full documentation, the full audit trail of what happened. And yes, this moved from dev to QA to production, and here's why, and here's who approved it, and it's all there. And you're not having to write, as Frank and you both did in your past, write a boatload of code in different tools to make all that happen. And then still there's an email or paper process, or if you're lucky, it might be in Jira, right? Where this is happening. And so everybody's trying to collaborate across 4 different tools, where DataOps.live gives you, as I said, that single pane of glass for everybody to collaborate within this common environment that handles all the technical stuff under the covers for you. So you don't have to write all of that code. And if Snowflake changes a feature, you guys manage that for us, so we don't have to go learn how to change the syntax in a whole bunch of code that's required to make our operations go.
Yeah, I think you guys hit on a really good number of points that I want to summarize and make sure the audience captured. So like I said, I still don't think more than 10-20% of Snowflake customers are really doing true CI/CD. It's still pretty new, but I wanted to capture a couple real key points for the audience. What Guy mentioned earlier, what makes this so much better and so important is the ability to do pretty much, I wrote an article about the automation of automation, but it's this automated testing, and it's really unit testing at a very granular automated level. And the reality is, for all the companies that aren't doing CI/CD or data ops, you're really going to start to fall behind because you need this. And also, one other thing I thought was interesting, what Guy said is I code a lot in the last year, especially last 3 months, with some of the generative AI tools. And it's easy because they do hallucinate sometimes to take some of that code and insert it and not test it. But that's what really this gives you is like you need to have some type of granular level of testing, automated and agile as fast as you can.
Mhm.
So Guy, we have just a few more minutes left, but one thing I did want you to kind of explain to the audience is maybe mention like DataOps.live. I think what people don't understand about it is that it really makes this whole process easier. Kent touched about it, but can you just talk like from a customer perspective, maybe from Roche or one of the other ones? It's transformative. I look at it as similar to how Snowflake was transformative to me. It's just this is a lot more stuff that happens, but I mean, really, DataOps.live is taking customers to a whole other level of data maturity. So can you just touch on that, like how it transformed the product delivery, data product delivery cycles, and companies that have taken on DataOps.live?
Yeah, so I mean, the typical sort of changes that we see, companies who are, maybe 2 years ago were doing, one release a quarter, fairly monolithic releases to releasing, I would say 300-400 times a month now. And, yeah, a massive part of that is through test automation. Because, when I change something, I need if I'm going to deploy it, I need confidence it's going to work. And if I have to test that manually, the bigger and bigger my data product gets, the greater and greater and greater my manual testing burden gets. And you get to the stupid point where, I've changed 3 lines of code, it took me half an hour, but it's going to take me 3 days to test it. I mean, that's the reality the software world got to and said, look, we just can't work like this. We have to have complete, test automation. So, test automation is a huge part of it, but it's, I think the biggest part of it is just the number of steps. I mean, Kent was talking about, back in 2016 when this was like, but yes, pre-infancy, even just going through that, there were, 15 steps you needed to do to, and that was one piece of a 30-piece puzzle. I would say in a, if I just look at a simple DataOps development process where someone says, okay, I've got a data product, I want to add a few new transform columns and add a few new automated tests to it. The engineer themselves has to do maybe 5 or 6 things. There are probably 2,997 things that happen to give them their branch, to give them all the permissions, to do, to run the test, to clean it up, all of the plumbing that just makes all of that happen. So, what we're doing is allowing the developer to do the 7 things that only they can do, because only they have the business knowledge, only they have the, the knowledge of the stakeholders and what they want. What we're saving them from doing is doing the 2,993 or whatever it is pieces, individual pieces, SQL statements here, grants over there, tests here, moving this stuff around, and it builds up in complexity. A few years ago, that was only 500 things. Now it's 1,000 things, and it's 1,500 things. As Snowflake gets more and more advanced, and the data pipelines get more and more complicated, and we introduce Cortex and Streamlit and container services and all these other things, the amount of plumbing and infrastructure that has to happen and hopefully happen behind the scenes is absolutely enormous. So it has to be done. It's not a question that has to be done. The question is, are you going to stand up a whole big team internally to do it yourself? If you've got a team of 8 or 10 people with nothing to do and budget for them, then great, go for it. In reality, most organizations say, hey, I want that done, what they've done for me. I did just want to pick up, there were a couple of great questions from Mike in the Q&A. Do we agree that continuous integration is even more important as we democratize data engineering? Absolutely. The more people we've got, the more disparate they are, the more different teams working on things, the less, I would say, kind of data professional people are, the greater and greater importance for continuous integration, because it means that these people who are not experts, maybe if I'm an expert and I spend a week's worth of work, I can troubleshoot it relatively straightforwardly. But if I'm a data citizen somewhere, that ability to say, well, hey, I broke something, but I only made 4 lines of change. Okay, even as a non-professional, I can troubleshoot that is critically important. And I do agree as well that the other question Mike asked was about this problem between the sort of the legacy enterprise IT. There is still a significant problem that the DevOps organization in big companies and the IT infrastructure / data infrastructure are typically separate teams. And whilst DevOps is a team rather than kind of like a horizontal discipline, you're always going to get that. People say, well, I'm the IT infrastructure manager, I'm the DBA. If you want to do DevOps, go and talk to DevOps people. So no, you've got to be part of that. You're not isolated from that. You've got to be working to get the benefit. You've got to be working in that with everybody else.
Thanks, Guy. Well, we're pretty much at the time. There were some questions. If we didn't answer them, we'll send out an email that actually to all the attendees that has a link to the recording, and we'll also answer the questions there. Thanks for joining us. Thanks you, Kent and Guy, for joining me, Frank Bell, Data Superhero, at our DataOps Unfiltered, and join us in 2 weeks for our next session.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Frank. Good to see you, Ken.
Bye, everybody.